want to do this in 4 parts. I want to just do a quick recap of what some of the threats are, refresh our memory from the session a couple weeks ago. Then I want to look at the range of potential responses, and then talk about sort of the assets that we have, the strengths, the things that are in our favor, and then some of the obstacles that we face in implementing those responses. And the obstacles, as we'll see, are significant. There's quite a few obstacles to getting where many people feel we ought to be. I know you people have probably by now become familiar with this, but just to recap, earlier I suggested this formula has been used for about 40 years now. It's quite popular. That the amount of environmental impact we experience is a product of a number of people, the level of consumption, their affluence, how they use natural resources, and the efficiency of the technology that they employ. And the general sense today is that although we've made dramatic improvements, environmental change continues to be very rapid and very extensive, and climate change is one of its most alarming dimensions. Climate change is alarming for all sorts of reasons. It's alarming because of the potential for, and we've already seen this, we saw this last year in Pakistan, we saw it in Bangladesh, we saw it in parts of China, for floods, for droughts and wildfires, for heat waves, for severe storms. But it's important to keep in mind that climate change interacts with 2 other sorts of problems. One is the continuing erosion of green capital, the continuing decline of valuable land cover like forests, for example, the continuing loss of biodiversity. And some scientists like E.O. Wilson have estimated that biodiversity loss is possibly 1,000 times or more what its natural rate should be. So as we change habitat, many species are not able to adapt to the changed circumstances, and they disappear. It's a hard figure to estimate because we don't know really the number of species on the planet, and so it's based on a lot of assumptions. But I think that the general intuition that biodiversity loss is severe, that the decline in forest cover and other types of land cover is severe, is well documented and widely shared. And for some people, biodiversity loss may be as serious a problem, a threat to the planet as climate change. There's also resource scarcities. You may or may not be familiar with the idea of peak oil, which suggests that there's a fixed amount of oil in the world, and at a certain point, the cost of oil will start to rise as we sort of move past easy, accessible, abundant access to oil. Fresh water is already a problem in many parts of the planet. Now these things interact. So climate change is linked to deforestation. Deforestation is linked to freshwater problems. Climate change is linked to freshwater problems, and so on. So there's a lot of synergy across these 3 domains of concern. And to give you a sort of, can you see that? Yeah, you can. So this comes from the IPCC reports, and sort of gives you a sense of all the types of problems that people who are tracking the implications of climate change worry about. Food shortages, water shortages, ultimately the potential to significantly and adversely undermine human health and welfare. We can look at the same issue in terms of the degree of global warming that we experience. And the general feeling is that with each 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature, we move closer and closer to what people speculate is the realm in which large-scale sort of collapses would begin to take place, in which evolution and adaptation would not be able to keep up with the extent of change. And as a result, whole systems might start to fail us. Fisheries, forests, hydrological cycles, things that keep us warm, things that keep us fed, things that provide us with appropriate places to live and so on. We don't know when that happens. We don't know whether it happens at 4 degrees or 5 degrees or what. But we do know is that for a lot of scientists, once we move past another degree or so of global warming, we're in unknown territory. We're in a territory where humans have not occupied. So humans have lived through from some fairly significant swings in temperature over the past million years. But at a certain point, we'll move into an area. And the question is, if it happens quickly, and if it means really, really intense drought or massive flood or changes in the general circulation of heat in the ocean such that all of Europe turns into a massive glacier in a decade, will we be able to cope with that? Or will that just be too much for most of humankind to continue to survive in? In terms of the loss of green capital, in some places it's remarkable. Haiti, this is a very famous image showing the boundary between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And Haiti is often described as essentially a moonscape, in which all of its forest cover, virtually all of its forest cover, has been removed. You can imagine that only a few years ago, the whole image would have been green. And it isn't just Haiti, it's much of Africa, and it's large parts of Pakistan. I don't remember if I showed you images from my work in Pakistan, but when you looked earlier, but in northern Pakistan, forest cover is probably about 5% of what it was 150 years ago. And that is where the Hindu Kush and the Himalayan mountains and the Karakoram ranges sort of meet. So it's very steep terrain. And when you remove the forest cover, the prospects for reforestation are very slim. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's difficult to do in a country like Rwanda, which has lots of hills. It's almost impossible to do in one of the most rugged mountainscapes on the planet. And that means that all the people who lived in the river valleys, who have their agricultural economies linked to the Indus River and so on, that system, all of a sudden they're subjected to massive mudslides and flooding, which really wipe out entire villages overnight. And the combination of deforestation and what we call glacial outburst floods, when glaciers reach a certain point and then suddenly open up and a whole lot of massive amounts of water come pouring down, make some of these areas of the world uninhabitable. And we're seeing this more and more. While forest cover is gaining ground in Europe and North America, so that the high rate of deforestation that was typical of the industrial age has now been reversed in most of the rest of the world, in Brazil, in Indonesia, in South Asia, and so on, in Central America, in Africa, in those parts of Africa where there's substantial forest cover. In most of the rest of the world, the trend is exactly the other direction. It continues to decline at a very, very alarming rate. And with satellite imagery, we get great indications, and we know what happens in Haiti. We know that Haiti has now reduced its development prospects and reduced the buffers that might protect it from things like storms and so on, as it reduces forest cover. So less arable land, less buffering, less ecosystem services, and so on and so forth. We don't know, by the way, if there's a point at which biodiversity loss would be sort of, critical to human welfare. We don't know if that's really the case. If we could live with considerably less biodiversity than we have, or whether we need this very rich biodiversity to create the conditions. There's different points of view, but most people think losing biodiversity, losing forest cover, at a certain point we're going to regret it. Peak oil, this is sort of, a fairly famous graph, which sort of, and lots of people look and they say, well, this is exactly what's happening. We saw these hits to our economy, to economic growth, because of, I think the combination of Iraq, the war on terrorism, the war in the war in Afghanistan probably should go up there, and sort of the easy access to credit in the last 15 years, plus the tax cuts of 2001, 2003, that combination of factors has in our country, in the US, generated a total debt in the range of 20 trillion. So about $9 trillion of federal government debt, about $8 trillion of debt related to the mortgage crisis, and about $3 trillion of state debt. Now our whole gross domestic product is 14 trillion. So we have, our own economy has entered a period for which we have no analogs, historical analogs. We've never had this much debt. Now some people look and say, but we've never had this much wealth either. So there's an awful lot of wealth locked up in the baby boom generation. It's not, but some people say, no, this is if we go any further than this, if we allow this to continue on, if we don't change the trajectory, then in 10 or 20 years from now, we will be, we will have suffered the fate of many other overextended major powers that simply they could not generate the revenues that were required for the sort of lifestyles they were funding. And we will start to find that we collapse, that we no longer have the capital to rebuild infrastructure, that we no longer have the capital to, whatever. Peak oil suggests that whatever the situation is, it's going to get worse as the cost of energy rises. One thing that we can sort of, one way of looking at world history is to argue that where human society has flourished has often been closely linked to large supplies of cheap energy. And those places that have not had large supplies of cheap energy have had more difficulty flourishing. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that those countries like us and Canada and Europe that had large supplies or could mobilize large supplies and could actually, Los Angeles and the car culture and the notion of suburbs are all predicated upon having continued access to cheap energy. This system in California could not work very well if energy prices suddenly went up dramatically. Because suburbs and cars and an absence of public transportation and all these things assume that you will be able to afford to heat and air condition your large house and drive your car regularly, and not at the cost of thousands and thousands of dollars a month, but at the cost of really very, very little of your income. So our model requires, especially on the West Coast, on the East Coast it's not quite as glaring, but on the West Coast it requires that we have tons and tons of cheap energy. And so people say, well, we've got an infrastructure built around that assumption. And if energy prices start to rise, if we don't find more supplies and if we can continue to, if we don't find that it actually becomes very cheap to bring oil and gas down from Alaska or the Arctic or something like that, if we discover that for ecological reasons or technological reasons this doesn't make sense, then the idea is that we will suddenly find that the premise of our economies and our social structures suddenly starts to fall away. The premise that we will continue to have cheap, abundant supplies of energy.
Wait, so dumb question potentially. The red line is the cost of oil?
The red line is the cost of oil.
What?
The red line is the performance of the economy.
Okay.
So what we're seeing is the economy growing, and
the
then
U.S. economy.
Yeah, the U.S. economy, and then suffering, growing during experience has continued to grow, and then the question is, will it start to decline dramatically if energy prices escalate, or if energy prices, if we find an alternative? But most people look and they say it's not going to be easy to find an alternative in the next 30, 40, 50 years to just how cheap oil and gas have become. It doesn't mean that we obviously there's tons of ideas, but the alternative energy forms only constitute probably 3 or 4% of our economy right now. So the transition, if oil prices went up by a factor of 10, and suddenly gas was not $4 a gallon, but $40 a gallon, that would change the complexion of suburban living, because we assume that your income is not going to go up by a factor of 10. So what do you do if it suddenly costs $600 to fill your car with gasoline, and you're living in Riverside or San Bernardino, and your job is in Irvine? Suddenly you've got an untenable situation. Will that happen? This is just, this is a prediction. I mean, nobody knows for sure. It's just linked to this notion of a peak oil crisis. And there are people like Ted Homer Dixon who sort of argue, well, this is what happened in the Roman Empire. Basically, to build, because Rome sort of was built, this very elaborate city of aqueducts. It had a population of 1 million people at its peak. But the only way they could build it was by bringing in energy from around it. And that energy came in the form of animals and people, slaves, and the stuff that they used, wood and so on. And what happened is as Rome got larger and larger, I won't touch this at all, as Rome got larger and larger, they had to go further and further to bring the energy in. And at a certain point in time, they were overextended. And when they went out to get energy here, and Rome was way over here, they discovered that the people living there could now defeat them. So initially, they could send out enough military capacity to bring back what they wanted. But as they got more and more overextended, they were no longer able to do it. And we had what people think of as the sort of the rise of the barbarians, those groups of people who came down from Asia who suddenly said, we're no longer going to pay tribute to Rome. Wrestle it from us, because we think we can beat your contingent of 50 Roman soldiers. And they could, and they defeated them, and Rome shrank from 1 million people to 10,000, and it happened very, very quickly. And here was this eternal city, this dramatic thing, which was sort of state-of-the-art technologically, where people could have fresh water baths and all sorts of wonderful things, and it fell apart. And for the next 1,000 years, roughly, Europe was really in what people refer to as the Dark Ages. But it was very, Hobbes says life was nasty, brutish, and short, and it was. It was nothing like Rome. The Renaissance, there was a recovery, and for economic reasons, Europe started to grow using its maritime technologies and its capacity to trade and so on. But for a long, long period after the collapse of Rome, it was a backwater to the world. So it has happened before. Easter Island, people look at how Easter Island required trees for fuel and for construction. And people also use these trees to move enormous statues into position on the shoreline. And they came to a point where they were actually cutting down more trees than were replacing, and forest cover declined, and suddenly they no longer had enough trees for energy and for construction and so on, and the place basically collapsed. So it may be that if you take away cheap energy from a system too quickly, it will not be able to adapt. Maybe.
So this is an example that's based on the U.S. economy, but I mean, is this generalizable to other
It is,
economies?
because the energy mix of much of the world is very similar in relying on fossil fuels. And everywhere in the world, I mean, there's slight differences in some places you get slightly more, like France, more reliance on nuclear energy or this or that. But basically, yes, it would affect China, and it would affect India, and it would affect Canada, and it would affect Russia. So it would affect, all these places dramatically. And it would not be easy to just, if this happens quickly, to fill the gap with, say, nuclear power or something like that. I mean, this is not something that you can do in a couple of years, or 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years.
Do they have any estimates on which countries are the most susceptible to something like this?
Well, I think that people feel that, generally speaking, China's very, very susceptible because it relies heavily on coal. The U.S. is very susceptible because it relies heavily on oil and gas, and so does Canada. Although Canada has a lot of hydropower, which is more renewable, depends how it's, how it's turned into energy. But but I think that there's a general sense that the U.S., the North America, and Asia are particularly vulnerable right now. Africa uses so much less energy, but it would be devastated. It relies, a lot of Africa's a big place, and there's lots of variation. A lot of it relies on wood for basic energy use. And so it faces a different type of challenge. But as forest cover declines, it faces some significant problems as well. And this comes from the last talk. There are those people who think the situation, the combination of these trends in things like oil and water, where they could get scarcer and more expensive, the loss of green capital like forest cover and biodiversity, and climate change, all of which interact to make things more and more volatile and alarming, are just very likely to overwhelm our economic and social structures. And then there are people who say, humans are tremendously resilient, they're tremendously innovative. As these things become obvious, all sorts of breakthroughs will take place. Who's right? Where do you line up? Let's assume that we want to respond to these things. Let's assume that we want to do something, that we want to take whatever measures we can. The overarching sort of idea that has gained acceptance, especially during the last 20 years, because it really moved onto the global agenda in 1987 through a report called Our Common Future, which was prepared by the United Nations under the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland. And it said what we need to do is we need to move towards sustainability. We need to move towards sustainability. Now, in the area of climate change, which we're focused on here, we can look at more precisely how do we move that way through things like mitigation, adaptation, and possibly geoengineering. But let's start off with the large overarching framework that many people feel that we've got to move towards more aggressive. In other words, there has been some movement, but at least in the eyes of those who are alarmed, it's not nearly enough. We are not basically moving towards a sustainable planet. Sustainability, the common definition, the definition from 1987, focuses on how do we meet our needs. We've got 6.5 billion people. How do we give those people food and shelter and water and the fundamental services that they have a right to, like education and health? How do we meet those needs without dramatically reducing the capacity of people 50 or 100 years from now to meet their needs? How do we do that? And the way to do it, or the idea is that the way to do it is to find a better balance between sort of economic imperatives, economic tools, economic processes, the way we produce things and consume things and dispose of things. And equity, what we think of as fair to the poor, fair to the future, fair to the non-human world, and what we think the environment can withstand. And we sort of look at the environment and say, the environment can assimilate a lot of our waste. You can put waste directly into a lake or the ocean and it will break it down and it will become part of the environment. But at a certain point that it can't. At a certain point you overwhelm its capacity, the air's capacity, the capacity of the oceans to break down our waste. The environment much of the environment can replenish itself. Forests regrow, fisheries, are repopulated. But at a certain point, we end up with net losses. So if a forest takes typically maybe 50 years to regenerate, if we're cutting down 5 or 10% of that forest a year, it is impossible for it to regenerate. We will cut down all of the forest before it's able to recover. If we take 1 or 2% a year, then in principle, it'll be a sustainable type of harvesting. Yeah.
So do you see sustainability and waste as kind of like two things on opposite ends of the spectrum, or how do you see the relationship between sustainability and waste?
Well, I mean, waste is inevitable. There's going to be some waste. And then the question is what level of waste is sustainable in terms of these three parameters? So in terms of what's fair, is it fair, for example, what we often do with our waste, what we're clever at doing with our waste, is displacing it into the poor. So we have ways of saying we'll move our dirty factories across the border into Mexico or into the poor neighborhoods. And there's an economic logic for that. Real estate values are lower there. It's, you know, if you're going to set up something that produces a lot of pollution, you're not going to buy land in Brentwood to set it up there. Will you buy land, you know, in some poor country to set up there? Yeah, but that's, you can see the logic economically, but it's not very fair, or doesn't seem fair. So there's the question of what the environment can absorb, assimilate, neutralize. How much waste can you put into the Great Lakes? A good example of abusing a water system is the Aral Sea. 50, 60 years ago, the Soviets thought that they could solve a number of problems by doing two sorts of things. One was to take more water, more of the water that fed the Aral Sea out to irrigate cotton fields in Kazakhstan. And they thought that if we do that, we give people secure employment and they won't be hard to control, because one of their concerns was always that Central Asia might be hard to maintain control over. And they said, we'll also put big plants up there and create employment and prosperity. The trouble is the Aral Sea shrank dramatically. It was a very inefficient system. It turned into a big dust bowl with a toxic mineral dust. And the farms were not sustainable, and people had to move. Over the course of several decades, it became a nightmare. And today, they're not sure that it can be reversed. So people look at that sea and they say, there's activity, there's experiments to try and rejuvenate it, to rehabilitate it, but they're extremely expensive and they haven't succeeded so far. So for a few years of providing cheap cotton and high-paying jobs, they took a whole system, an enormous body of water, and they turned it into basically a toxic dust bowl. So how much can we draw out of nature and how much can we put into it before it starts to collapse? What's fair in terms of displacing waste into poor neighborhoods where the economics are obvious, or the other thing, projecting it into the future, trying to find a way to move the costs. We'll pollute now and we'll let the next generation worry about that. So we won't, these are called negative externalities in an economic system, where you don't pay for all the costs of production and disposal and so on, transportation. And some of those costs, like air pollution, they build up, but you're not paying for them, so somebody else is going to get the bill in 20 or 30 or 50 years. So it's these questions of, at the same time, if we move too aggressively, if we adopt a sort of deep ecological worldview, and we want to change everything, there's a group of people, who go to each of the climate change meetings. They'll be in Mexico this month, and they were in Copenhagen last year, and they say, not climate change, system change. And what they're saying is the whole system has to change. It's not fair and it's not sustainable. But the fact is, we do want paychecks and we do want jobs and we do want roads and we do want schools and we do want those things. So we're not, how much are we prepared to change? How much makes sense to change? And while we don't want to give up a great deal, apparently, there's still a billion people in the world who don't have enough. So you can't look at this bottom billion and say, well, actually we're cutting back everywhere, because they're still not meeting basic needs for adequate nutrition and adequate energy and adequate infrastructure. So we have some people who want more for arguably valid reasons, and other people who don't want to give much because we've got such a great life here. And so how much economic restructuring can you do? And sustainability is about trying to find a better balance than the one we have. And the reason you want a better balance is because people look and they say, what we have today is not sustainable. This is a famous set of calculations, and many people have done them. And they're rough, the first number is shrinking. So over time, the second number is shrinking. So you have X amount of productive land, and some people also look at productive ocean, however you want to include it, on the planet. And everything else, everything that's not human, requires some share of this energy. It needs to eat, it needs some of it for habitat and so on. And people have estimated that could be as much as half of it. In other words, if we wanted the rest of all the other non-human species to flourish, they require part of that productive land. Some of it has to be set aside for their habitat, for their energy needs. Scientists don't know exactly what that magic number is, but it's been estimated between 12 to 50%. And so that, based on 12 to 50%, it means we have about 1 to 1.5 hectares of productive land available for each person today. And as population grows, that number will get smaller and smaller. So if we're at 6.5 billion today, but we rise to 8.5 or 9 billion, that number will get smaller. But we're using much more than that. It's called overshoot. So we're actually living on much more than the productive land. And what does that mean if we're living on much more than it? What it means is we're not living sustainably. It means we're using things faster than they can be replenished. We're overwhelming systems. We are, depending on how you look at it, taking away from the future. Are we taking away from the future? Not every economist agrees with that way of thinking. But one way of thinking is that to use, it's sort of like if you've got $500,000 saved for retirement, and you think you're going to live for 30 years, you and your spouse, and your accountant says to you, with your $500,000, what you can afford to spend is $20,000 a year. If you want your children to inherit the $500,000, and if you just want it to last over the 30 years, you can spend, I don't know the number, but $60,000. And you can have a choice. If you want to spend it up, you can spend $60,000 a year, or if you want to pass it on to your children, you can spend $20,000. Well, if you live on 60, it's sort of pretty inevitable what's going to happen. You're going to use it all up. And if you live on 100, you're going to use it up really, really quickly, even before you're done. So you have to make a decision. Are you going to live on 20,000? Maybe you say, that's not enough to live. I can't live it. Are you going to pass nothing to your children? Are you going to pass part of it? But you sort of know the parameters. And so what people are saying is we're overshooting the parameters of what would be leaving a healthy environment to the future. Right now we are not just reducing the amount of productive land available by growing our numbers, but also by overusing it. So less forests, less fisheries, less everything. So what are we going to do? We're going to add something like 3 billion people to the planet, and many people still aspire to our sort of lifestyle, but these people who do these calculations say that for everybody today to live like an American, we need 2 more planets. We need 2 more planets full of oil and natural gas and fresh water and forest cover and arable land for everybody to live like an American. Because we're using not in our country, we're not using 0.9 to 1.5 hectares per person. We're using in the order of, I don't think I put the number down, but in the order of 10 or 12 hectares per person. So we're using way more than what would just be a mathematical allocation across 6.5 billion people. And obviously that's not possible for 6.5 billion people. We couldn't all use 10 or 12 hectares of productive land. It's not viable. So what do you do? If you look at it Oh yeah, there is. So there you see very clearly, if you're in Afghanistan, you're living on actually less than what some people might say is an equitable allocation. Now, is that equitable? Should we think that everybody has the right to 1.5 hectares? Is that a useful? It's a starting point for discussion. You know, if you're living in a country like Canada, you have way more hectares per person. Canada is one of the few countries that is actually living on it way less than it's more than the global average, but way less than what its country produces. So it has this enormous expanse of land with only 33 or 35 million people. We're actually living on more than our country produces, so we have to import stuff into it. We have to import it from somewhere else. We have to get it from somewhere else. And so do many other places, like Japan, Russia, and Germany, the UK. Russia is another country with enormous natural resources and green capital and all that. So it's probably living on more than its share globally, but less than what its territory can produce. But the point is, it's pretty obvious if you look at this, where South Asia, North Asia, and all through Africa, they're living on very little. US and Canada, Europe, Japan, we're living on an awful lot. So that doesn't seem sustainable from any perspective. Where are we going to continue to get this cheap energy that we need to have this lifestyle? And is it fair to other people in the world, or fair to the future generations of Americans who may discover that they're facing severe water problems in San Diego or Los Angeles because of our behavior? And they may look at us and say, how could you possibly have left us these ruined cities of Las Vegas and San Diego? How could you have done this to us for 40 or 50 years? How could you take this country with all its power and vitality and leave these things behind? Now, we'll see that later. Some economists say there's a different way of looking at this. If we leave them enough technology and skills and stuff like that, maybe we'll give them the capacity to cope with that, those energy and water crises in San Diego and Las Vegas. But that's a strong bet. What we do know is that to move from the situation that looks unsustainable to one that's sustainable, we need to mobilize our government at different levels. We need to mobilize the private sector, from small business to big corporations. We need to mobilize people in households. And none of these groups have been very much mobilized so far. Typically in America, environment, sustainability are way down in terms of our priorities. Our typical priority is the economy. That's where we tend to say, this is what government should focus on. I want my money to grow. I want to know that I'll have $1 million when I retire. I want to know that my house will be worth $600,000 when I retire. I want that assurance from you. I don't want you to be playing any games with those things. That's what's most important to me. And if you say, well, it'll all be for naught if oil costs $400 a tank, they sort of understand that, but our priorities tends to be economic. And then other things like healthcare and education and safety in the streets tend to be higher up on the agenda of our concerns. The number of Americans, based on surveys done at Yale a couple of years ago, for whom climate change really ought to be a priority, responding to climate change ought to be a priority, because they think it's a real threat to America's future, is almost the exact same as the number of Americans who think that gay marriage ought to be the focus of policy change, and that if allowing it would be a threat to her. So we have about 1/5 of Americans who think we should focus more attention on climate change, and about 1/5 of Americans who think we should focus more attention on banning gay marriage. And those people at that end, and you can see why it's difficult for somebody in Washington to find consensus. Because if your priority, if your biggest fear for our country is that gay people will be allowed to marry, if that's your biggest fear, and that's what you're prepared to get out and vote on and act on, and you don't even think of climate change, it's pretty hard for a government to say, I've got a policy that's going to please everybody. And in the middle are the people who basically say, deal with the economy first. Let's get the economy. The economy is our biggest threat. So these are rough figures, but you can think of it sort of the overwhelming majority, 60% worried about the economy, a smaller percentage worried about climate change, and then a smaller percent worried about these sort of social moral issues as the things that really need to be addressed, that are urgent, that threaten our country's future. Now, many people say, look, government it's very hard for government to make enormous progress on these issues for this reason, because of pluralism, because of because our system is both wonderful and also deeply frustrating because of this separation of powers, because Congress can slow things down and bring them to a stop. And we know that on climate change in particular, Congress has basically said, you're never going to get a very aggressive climate change policy through Congress. And you don't have the authority to do it through the White House. So we're sort of in this situation. Now people say, okay, if government can't do this, and we've seen it's hard for government to radically reform healthcare or change its position on, if you think of what the current president came in, we're going to close Guantanamo, but it's not closed. We're going to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but they're not ended. We're going to bring in universal healthcare, but we're still nowhere close to universal healthcare. Those are hard battles to win in a pluralist society where powers are not unified under him. So it isn't like some countries where the president can say, this is the way we're going, and everybody is going in this direction. It's an endless fight, and it's a fight that the victories are often small. Civil society has enormous power. But the typical consumer, the typical American says, I believe this is important, and I believe I'm not doing very much. It's a little bit like nutrition. There's been a massive effort to educate Americans about good nutrition. All sorts of things. Every kid who goes through the school system learns about the food pyramid, or its more complex, recent version. My kids look at some complicated mapping of food nutrition. But the diets of Americans are actually deteriorated. So even as we've got better and better science on nutrition, our diets have gotten worse and worse. People say it's we're working longer hours. Fast food is actually cheaper, it's more convenient, it tastes better. We know, got to go to the market. But the market is a major and expensive process, and you have to get there, and you spend more money, and you bring it home, and you prepare it. And man, you can walk into Albertsons and get your whole meal in a little box for $5.99. And so even though we know about it, we don't do much. And climate change is sort of similar. Many people know about it, not everybody. There's a lot of misunderstanding. But even those who know about it, very few of them have changed their habits. They're not walking more, they're not driving less, they're not eating less. They're not doing very much. Business, many people would like to see business as the motor of change. Because if business started to really move towards sustainability, the potential for change would be enormous. And a fairly strong case for sustainability has emerged that many business leaders recognize. They recognize that lots of things, improving energy efficiency, you're not going to regret it. It's a good thing, period. Being more efficient, producing less waste is a good thing. Even if climate change turns out to be overstated, if many of the same actions would make you more efficient or reduce air pollution or these sorts of things, so there'd be benefits anyways. So it isn't like you're going to say, I'm going to move in this direction. I'm going to put all my money on the New York Giants in the Super Bowl, and it's a sort of zero-sum game. No. If you move in this direction, there's benefits, equity benefits and efficiency benefits and other types of benefits, partly because the environmental stuff is all interconnected. Consumer preferences. The younger generation, the generation that has been raised, that was sort of born since Rio, the people born after 1992, they have probably more completely internalized concerns about climate change and the concept of sustainability. Something that earlier generations, so people who are in their 50s or 60s today who are leading the country, for them this may be still quite abstract. But the younger generation, for them this appears, according to survey work, more real. And so they are saying, a lot of people are now saying, the type of car I will buy, the type of home I will have for my family, will have to meet some green criteria. I am not at 30 or 40 going to move into a house which I think is really, really unsustainable, or have a car which I really, really think is unsustainable, or invest my retirement into funds that I think are really, really damaging to the planet. So people are now looking at it and saying, well, you know, if you build housing in Orange County today and it's not sort of green, you may find that those people who are building green housing are going to be much more successful in the resale market 10 or 20 years from now, when the kids who are 18 or 20 today buy their first home. Because they're going to look at it and going to say, I want this home with the indigenous landscaping and with, you know, and we know, by the way, in California, that fully sustainable homes with almost no ecological footprint, homes with clean water in, clean water out, homes that we know that they can be built for just as cheaply as traditional homes, stick and frame housing. And in fact, there are entire developments in the desert for low-cost housing, which use all sorts of contemporary technologies to better use sun energy and wind energy and these sort of things, and they are net exporters of energy. We have entire housing developments of low-cost housing in California that don't require any energy input into them. So we know it's possible, but we also know that that isn't the case for 9 or 10 homes that are being built. But people are saying, what if it changes? What if the first home that you want to buy, that today's 20-year-old wants to buy, is the greenest home they can get in the neighborhood, not the biggest? Are we missing that? Are we going to be regretting that? There's also a carbon market that is emerging in the world. So if you do, as a big business, start to become more efficient, it may well be, depending on how this all shapes out, that you can make money at efficiency, that you can sell your rights to pollute or whatever it is to those who have not made that turn. There's also a sense that if the trends are real, regulation is going to come. And there are some first mover advantages. People who anticipate regulations correctly and realize that we have to move in a certain direction may benefit. There's also clear cycles between those who understand innovations that are emerging and those who prosper. And if we go back in time, there have been a number of revolutions that people focus on. The first was some 10,000 years ago, when the first agricultural societies took shape. We're not entirely sure. It seems that this may have been triggered to some extent by environmental scarcity. But in any case, what we had is, we had a world of hunter-gatherers who knew minimal amounts, apparently, about agriculture. They understood plants, they understood what they could eat, they understood even a little bit if they cleared this, next year there'd be more berries on the bush. They had some rudimentary understanding, but they moved. And when the first societies that started to become settled emerged 10,000 years ago around the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Indus River system and the Yellow River system, around those river systems, they were able actually to generate whole new levels of wealth and to divide labor in remarkable new ways and take off. And all of a sudden they became much more powerful and successful than the hunter-gatherers. They displaced the hunter-gatherers. Same with those who got on to the Industrial Revolution 300 years ago that sort of began in Europe. Those people who were able to mobilize the steam engine and mobilize those sort of things and change production. They essentially helped take Europe from being sort of a backwater continent to being the most powerful part of the planet. And it happened very, very quickly. Because a steam engine could do the work of, 70 people. So if you could suddenly do that, you could sadly, cut down an awful lot more trees, till an awful lot more land, travel a lot further distances, fight a lot harder, do all these things. We know it took a toll, but we also know that those who were part of that system became tremendously wealthy. The same with the information age. All sorts of people in California became almost overnight millionaires and billionaires. Look at the Bill Gateses of the world, the Henry Samuelis of the world, who understood information technology and what it could do and what was going to be out there, and could find a way to take that knowledge and stuff like this and make it into and commercialize it, who understood back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, I mean, the idea of a personal computer was the idea of a handful of engineering kids in Silicon Valley building their own little things. Incredibly complex, and much of the world looked at it and said, this is way too complex to ever replace the typewriter and the telephone and all the things that we use, the television set. But some people gravitated into that world and said, no, this is the path of the future. We want to get in early on this. We want to contribute to it. We want to be owners of these innovations. We want to bring these innovations into our businesses. And clearly, that was an opportunity for tremendous prosperity to be part of that. Now people are saying, is it possible that the next real revolution in production and consumption and disposal is going to be around the sort of things that we link to sustainability, whole system design, biomimicry, that is thinking of things from what some of the people call cradle to grave, where they come from, how they're used, and how they're disposed of, and try to make it that at each part you have reduced or eliminated the environmental impacts. Biomimicry, looking at nature and saying, how is nature adapted to different situations? What can we learn from? And we discovered there's all sorts of things you can learn from nature about cooling and heating and moving and so on and so forth. So can we move into these things? Factor 4 and factor 10 are notions that we need to produce more with less energy. So some people say to save the planet, we will need to produce 4 times as much, or use 1/4 as much energy to produce the same amount, or 1/10 as much energy to produce X. So if today it costs X to produce a car, what we need to become sustainable is to produce that car with 1/10 the energy. So you can see that the business case has a whole lot of dimensions, but this is also really in some ways applicable to government, which procures a lot, makes a lot of decisions, and to consumers who also consume a lot. So it isn't that this is limited to them. But there is increasingly, even in Orange County, when I moved to Orange County, and I talked about sustainability, and most people just really, when I worked with a lot of private companies here, and they mostly looked at me as if I must be from Humboldt County and was probably one of those tree-hugging nutcases who just hadn't really got a foot in the real world. Because, this was hippie stuff. This was San Francisco, Humboldt County. This was not forward-looking, profit-making. This was not. The sustainability had nothing to do with what is the profit dimension here? What is the value dimension here of your idea? It was a constraint on it. The idea was that sustainability meant some other layer of constraints on what we can do to transform resources into commodities and services that people want. And every time you say, Americans want hamburgers. How do you produce your cheap hamburger? Well, you can't take too much care of your cattle. You can't spend too much time worrying about what gets mixed in with the meat. And you got to do it strategically. So we'll say, okay, they want cheap hamburger. That means you got to allow X amount of hair and feces in there, and you don't have to get people to take tumors out, and you can add fat from different animals into the same meat if you want to keep your meat costs down. And if you say, well, I don't want hair or feces in there, and I don't want fat from any other animal in there, and I don't want all this stuff in my hamburger. Guess what's going to happen to the cost of your hamburger? It's going to get more expensive. We don't know any other way to produce a hamburger cheaply. If you're suddenly going to raise the cattle in a humane way and feed them well and look after them and make sure they're healthy and inspect your meat, it's suddenly not going to be available for 99 cents. It's not going to happen. So we have to make a decision. And business leaders said that's the trouble with sustainability. If you want the healthy hamburger, then it's an $8 hamburger, not a $1 hamburger. And if we have $8 hamburgers, there isn't going to be a potential for a McDonald's every 60 feet. So all of a sudden, hamburger is going to be a once a week treat for an average American family, not twice a day, 14 days, 20 days a month or whatever. We currently eat that. Is that really true? Well, what we've seen is over time people have said maybe that's not a fair way of thinking about sustainability, that all it does is add cost to production and start to make more and more people less likely to purchase that service or good. Maybe there's a lot of other ways to think about sustainability, which makes it much sounder from a business perspective. And so over time, today in Orange County, what you hear mostly is that the next wave of development is probably going to be retrofitting housing to be more sustainable, things like that. So in 15 years, there's been a sea change. Is it enough? Well, not so far. Should we take a break for 10 minutes and then finish up, because we're almost at the end. Yes? Okay. Take a break. We'll stop on. We'll get into climate change for the last 20 minutes, then we can ask questions. Good. The trouble is when we talked about this, I keep trying to be upbeat, and you folks keep pulling me into concern. But let's focus now on climate change. So under the aegis of sustainability, people have tended to focus on two things: mitigation, which means reducing emissions simply, and adaptation. Knowing that already some changes have taken place and some changes will continue to take place. I'm not a scientist, you folks are, but we know that there's something like a degree of heat in the oceans that's going to be transferred, and it's going to mean, we're going to live in a world of more fires and longer droughts and higher floods and more hurricanes. We're going to live in that world. That is sort of guaranteed. So how do we adapt to that world? But how do we change transportation and housing and agriculture and so on to a world with more droughts and more flooding and so on? And how do we also at the same time try and put a cap on this and say, okay, this is as much severity and change as we want to accept, we're going to try and cap this. And people don't know what the magic number is, 550 parts per million CO2 or 600. And the reason they don't know that, because they don't know fully all the environmental consequences at different levels, and because there's disagreements about what the costs would be. But the point is, pretty well everybody thinks that mitigation and adaptation are a good way to start thinking about getting control, managing this climate change thing, and starting to, and that it dovetails well with the logic of sustainability. And it dovetails well for a number of, and here's, I think, a nice little diagram, which shows you sort of, how these things, an easy way of thinking about the relationships between mitigation, between adaptation, and between, the impacts of climate change. And where do we want to, so the question becomes, where do we want to put our investment, and who needs to put the investment there, and how do we put that investment there? And what happens if we don't? And to some extent, the idea is that the less mitigation you do, the more adaptation you'll have to do, because the impacts will be greater and greater. So these things are all related. Now I'm sure you understand that, and I'm not going to. This will be on the website, so I'm not going to go through it. But this is just a common sort of vocabulary code from IPCC of many of the key terms, in case you need to to refer them, but I'm not going to go over them. First, because you probably know them all, but secondly, because it would be sort of, I want to get right into mitigation. So mitigation, there's lots of ways of defining it. What I use here is I think, a way that most people would understand. You're trying to reduce the amount of energy that your economy requires, and then you're trying to reduce the amount of carbon in that energy that your economy requires. So you're saying if your economy requires X amount of energy, let's get it down to 1/4 that, or 1/10 that, or something much smaller, and let's have less carbon in that mix. Nicholas Stern wrote a report in 2006, a very famous report, and in 2006 he argued that we would need to take, so the world economy generates something, somebody could check this, but it's around $30 trillion, maybe off, doesn't really matter. I know the US economy is around 14 trillion. The rest of the world is probably larger than that, so whatever. But Stern argued that we would need to invest 1% of that, 1% of that into climate change mitigation and adaptation. And if we don't, I mean, the number of assumptions about what would be how those impact costs would mount. He said, in a matter of decades, it'll be costing 20% of the global economy to deal with adaptation and mitigation. And since that, he's revised it to 2%. So he started off with 1%, and then a couple of years later, he said it's actually a little more expensive. It's 2%.
Could you say that that's similar to the national debt? You know, if we reduce it, or if we start to reduce it now, it'll help us to save a lot in interest later.
Yes, that's true.
The analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of people feel that that's a really good reason for trying to start to get control over the national debt. That and the fear that if people holding American dollars ultimately lose confidence and don't invest in keeping those valuable, we could have a currency collapse. So it's the amount we'll pay and the possibility that we'll be paying more in dollars that are worth less. The OECD has agreed that the longer we wait, the more expensive it will be. Now, this is true in many things. I mean, not in all things. For example, if you take the field of healthcare, there's a significant debate over how much intervention versus how much treatment. And it turns out that in some areas, intervention makes a huge amount of sense. It's a no-brainer to do up your seatbelt rather than treat the accident. Because the number of injuries related to wearing a seatbelt versus the number of injuries related to not wearing a seatbelt, the disparity is so great that pretty well everyone agrees that wearing a seatbelt makes sense. And the fact that still something like 1/4 of Americans do not wear their seatbelts, and especially on short trips, which are the ones where they have the most accidents, means that an enormous amount of health costs that could be avoided are being internalized by our healthcare system and allocated across all of us in the cost of health insurance just because some people won't wear seatbelts. That's crazy. Other things are unclear. For example, there is not much evidence, and having gone through this with all of my kids, I can say, I can see both sides of it. But there's not much evidence that after a certain point, at which point your child should move from a car seat into the regular adult seat. And so there's been different rules in California, and basically what has happened is kids have gotten older and older and bigger before they're allowed to move into a regular adult seat. Now what turns out is that there isn't much evidence to say that your kid needs to be 80 pounds to sit in a regular seat. And so some people say, well, but there's car seat manufacturers who have a big interest in this intervention. So there are areas where the data are not very good and we don't really know. I don't think anybody would disagree that your kid needs to be in a child seat at the age of 1 or 2 or 3, but at 6 or 7 or 8, The evidence is not there. And there are some things where it's the opposite. I mean, you know, research at UCI has determined that it's probably much cheaper, that smokers probably cost the healthcare system much less than non-smokers, because smokers tend to die much earlier and much more quickly. So that if you can get somebody to smoke for 40 years, you're dealing with a heart attack in most of the cases, or something like that, cancer, and they die relatively quickly. If you get people who are basically healthy, then what they're going to deal with is long chronic illnesses that start at sort of 75 or 80 and last for years and cost an enormous amount. So some people look at this and say, every 85-year-old is costing a ton to our system, whereas everybody who dies as a smoker at 63 is sort of a net gain for our system. So sometimes it's counter. That's not advocating smoking. It's just that sometimes the data don't support the intuition, because lots of people's intuition is that smokers must be an enormous drain. It's a little bit like the immigrant thing. Lots of people just feel intuitively that immigrants must be expensive, especially if they're illegal. But when economists look at it, they tend to find that it's actually the opposite, that immigrants tend to actually be tremendous value added to our economy and not much of a cost to it. So now, some people don't care about the facts, but the point is that some interventions make a lot of sense, some we're not really clear about, and some are intuitively, they sound right, but the numbers don't support them well. In any case, many people think that delaying interventions now is probably a mistake. That the longer we delay, the worse off we'll be. But we have so much uncertainty related to climate change. And if you do I know that you had an economist speak earlier, and she probably talked about cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis, I'm not an economist, so I can simplify it really easily. But cost-benefit analysis basically comes out of the sort of concerns about social utility and social welfare. And the idea is that, look, the market isn't perfect. Okay, markets fail. They fail because there's not enough information. They fail because they can externalize some of their costs. And so so you can look at a society and you can say the market is suboptimally allocating and using resources. There would be a better way to do this for the overall welfare of a society. And when you make that case, and people look at it and they say, yeah, you're right. There's a better way to do this, and the market isn't getting us there. Then people say that's when the government should come in and introduce a regulation or subsidize something to change it, so that we get this higher level of efficiency in our system. Typically, to make that calculation, you have to be pretty certain about the cost in either direction. With climate change, of course, people are not that certain. And because they're not that certain, because there's a lot of gray area in what these costs will be, it's not obvious, it's not easy to make the case in sort of hard data of whether it's better to intervene today or in 5 years or in 20 years. Because when you don't intervene, the argument is, if you're not intervening, then you might be building up value elsewhere which could be used for later interventions. So, in other words, the question is, would you rather have cheaper water in 30 or 40 years from now, or would you rather that society left you lots of money so that you could buy more expensive water and maybe do other things as well? And we don't know really what's going to happen. You don't know whether actions today will keep the water price down, but you also don't know how high it might get. And but the point is, it's uncertain. So you can't sometimes do these simple things. So scientists and economists make assumptions. They make assumptions like, look, let's take a number, stabilizing the climate at 550 parts per million CO2. What would that require based on our best scientific understanding? It would require pretty big cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. And we look at that and we say, how do we do that? Modify it. How do we reduce those emissions? Well, there's a number of ways we can reduce the emissions. One way is we can stop subsidizing fossil fuels. And fossil fuel subsidies are complicated. For example, typically people say our presence in the Persian Gulf, which is very expensive military presence, is really a subsidy to oil, because it's really trying to keep cheap oil available into the global economy. That's a primary purpose. It may also be there to warn people not to meddle in Israel. It may be there for other reasons, but largely it's to make sure that cheap oil continues to flow out of these things, just like our support for, say, the government of Saudi Arabia could be interpreted as a way of trying to ensure that lots of cheap oil goes. Now those costs are not picked up by the oil industry. So BP isn't paying the cost of our Persian Gulf presence. It isn't paying the cost of these things. And so you can look at that and say, if that's the reason, if we're there largely to make sure that they can get lots of cheap oil out so we can buy it cheaply out of pumps, or maybe not much of that oil comes through our pumps here, but into the world's pumps, then that industry is being subsidized. Because the argument is if we stop doing that, maybe the government of Saudi Arabia would be overthrown, and oil would fall into different hands. And think of Chavez, something like this, somebody saying, guess what? We're going to change the terms. We're going to change the terms of the agreement. We're going to nationalize the oil sector, and we're going to oblige anybody who wants part of our oil sector to accept lower profits and more investment into our local communities. We want lower profits and more investment into the communities of the Middle East. But that might be what happens. So subsidies are a big issue, and they come in all sorts of forms. Reforestation is obviously a different way, because you're saying, one way of reducing emissions is to increase carbon storage. And alternative energy is I think, obvious. If you have forms of energy that aren't emitting, then you need more and more units that way. So typically, people are saying to mitigate, you have to avoid emitting, or at least minimize it. Some people also say, think of mitigation in terms of compensating people for the impacts of not reducing. That's that's a bit of a strange way to do it. Adaptation. So mitigation is one thing, and we know the tools available, but we also know the difficulties, because we can see the arrangements. Every one of us has a house or a car or an apartment or something, and we need gas for our stove, and we need gas for our car, and we need oil for heat, whatever you use, oil for heating. And so if those prices were to rise, then more and more of our income would be going to meet those needs, and less would be available for other things. And so even though it's sort of like the hamburger example. If you want a $1 hamburger, you can't be too fussy about what's going in it. If you want an $8 hamburger, you can really demand a very high quality, but you're going to be eating a lot fewer of them in your life. If it costs you $200 to fill your car with gas, you're going to drive it less. Or public transportation is going to become more attractive, or walking, or scooters, or biking. So how do we make this move? People say, well, one thing we know for sure is that the world is changed. Mitigation is about trying to slow down the pace of change or arrest it at a certain point, so that the more bleaker views of the future don't transpire. But we also know that we have to adapt to heat waves and wildfires, and we know that some of these things we do here already in California. In Irvine, for example, dwellings have to be built of fire-resistant materials, and there's things you cannot use wood for roofs in California. So there are things that we've done because they just make sense given our exposure. And the idea is that more and more of these things, we'll be doing more and more of these things as we face more droughts and more wildfires and more floods and more storms, and things will have to be built to different standards. And one of the problems is that this could be very expensive. If it starts to involve the transportation infrastructure of New York City, then it becomes a very expensive proposition to adapt to a harsher set of environmental pressures on that. And where does that money come from? Where does that money to adapt come from? So I don't know how I got in there. Oh, I know because I'm going backwards. So I talked to you before about adaptation in terms of understanding our vulnerability, and that the more adaptive, and we have to reduce, if the world is changing and we're vulnerable to it, then we either have to change our exposure, we have to move away from the sea, we have to move away from the areas that could experience drought, away from the areas that could burn up in wildfires. We have to reduce our sensitivity, we have to increase our adaptive capacity. And in a global perspective, there's lots of ways of going about this. And so this is just one set of measures that people in this field use. It's not the only set, there's other ways of thinking about it. But we can think of for much of the world, building adaptive capacity is more or less synonymous with poverty alleviation and development generally. In other words, if you increase household income, if you give people, if you make more education, you tend to make them more resilient in the face of not just a flood or a drought, but also disease or different forms of violence or economic dislocations generally. So at one level, so a lot of people want adaptation to be linked closely to development. In fact, 2 years ago, under pressure from the governments I think Germany, Finland, and maybe the UK, the Secretary General of the UN required that every unit and agency in the UN, every unit and agency, prepare a report on the security implications of climate change from the perspective of its activities. So if you're a UNDP and you're out there, helping to rebuild societies and alleviate poverty and deal with this, what would climate change do to your activities? And if you're Habitat and you're building homes, or if you're UNICEF and you're helping children, what would climate change do? What were the security concerns? And the G77, that's the block of countries that are developing, they basically rejected this. So the report came out, and the G77 countries said, this is not the way we want to think of adaptation and climate change. We don't want to link to security, to one of the threats, one of the concerns. We want to link to development. We want a lot of effort focused right here that poverty reduction is a form of adaptation for much of the world. And so it isn't a question of moving adaptation funds into other areas. We still need to focus a lot on basic development. Basic development for much of the world is the best line of defense. Is that true? That's one way of thinking about it. Now, as you move along, other people want to focus on building response capability. So what can you do to improve things like,
did that UN bill ever get passed?
It was a report, Secretary General report.
Oh,
It is public.
Oh, and it's public?
And it comes up with a series of recommendations about the ways in which climate change, the security implications of climate change.
Okay.
And it identifies different roles for different UN agencies and things that they ought to be doing. But what happened is many people thought that report would become a foundational document and be a building block for adaptation and mitigation. People would say, if climate change threatens the world in these ways, there's a good rationale, let's build on that. And what the developing world said, we don't like that language, because that language suggests to us that maybe you could use that language to say, the welfare of the world requires that we reduce deforestation in Brazil, and therefore we're going to impose strong measures on Brazil if it doesn't reduce deforestation. And so the countries were saying, this is not a security issue, this is a development issue. Don't focus on the the world of security, which suggests winners and losers, and it suggests maybe using force, and all that sort of stuff that comes with that idea. It suggests maybe the UN Security Council will make decisions about linked to climate change impacts, that sort of stuff. Don't do that. Let's keep it linked more closely to development and the constraints on development. And say what climate change does is it keeps a lot of people poor, and it rolls back the gains made in Africa, and it makes it more difficult for Sierra Leone and Congo to rise out of poverty. And that is largely the fault of the wealthy countries who externalized many of the negative costs of their own development. So they created climate change. And we don't want to now be thinking, well, we've got to protect the rainforests of Brazil. We want you to be thinking, we've got to eradicate poverty in Africa to deal with climate change, to adapt to climate change. Now, clearly, that doesn't require, I mean, climate change then just becomes one of many reasons why we want to promote development. And the idea is that development will increase resilience to a wide range of things that people around the world face. Development means less disease. Development means less, loss when there's an economic change. It means less loss to a flood. It means all those things. As you move along, you start to incorporate more and more climate science information into the adaptation measures. They become more explicitly linked. You're now saying, well, a good adaptation measure would be to have better weather monitoring so that farmers in Rwanda could make more informed decisions about what to do, so that they can make more informed decisions about what forests to rehabilitate and where it doesn't make sense to settle people, these sorts of things. All the way to measures which say, okay, we're facing sea level rise, or we're facing more wildfires, and how do we build? What sort of things do communities need to do in a world of, what if you're Bangladesh or Pakistan now, or the Netherlands, and you know that you're going to get flooded? What sort of measures can you take? And if you look at in the Netherlands, adaptation is now, in many ways, it's a very, very sophisticated area of research involving a lot of synergy among architects and engineers and climate scientists and policymakers as they ask the question, what will the Netherlands have to look like to flourish under scenarios of worsening climate impacts? What will we do? And they've developed really amazing models of their entire country where they can sort of show almost at the level of buildings and roads what could happen. And now if you're in Bangladesh, you don't have that level of sophistication. But you do know that it floods, 20 million people move, they're subjected to disease, and increasingly, in many parts of the world, fewer and fewer of them are able to go back after a couple of weeks. So people are being moved, sometimes permanently, and so on. So adaptation then is a whole set of responses, and there's disagreement in the world about, in an ideal world, we put resources behind everything. We build ways to manage floods and ways to reduce the impacts of fires, and we build better monitoring systems and alert systems, and we give people, better ways to coordinate their efforts, and we reduce poverty. In an ideal world, we push the whole agenda forward, and at the same time, we push the mitigation agenda forward, and we'd be reducing emissions and reducing carbon intensity of our energy and reducing the energy intensity of our economy. We'd be doing all those things together. But of course, different, what appears as a priority depends in large measure on where you stand in the planet. And if you're in Bangladesh, you have a different sense of what you need than if you're in northern Canada. And so it's not always easy to coordinate and decide. But what we do know is that generally speaking, however you view increasing adaptive capacity, and however you identify where are the areas that are most urgent, that require the most attention most immediately, there's general agreement that we're not investing enough in this. So the actual amount of funds available to the developing world for adaptation is very small compared to most estimates of what it needs. and it's going to negotiate through the next 50 years successfully. This is a little bit hard to read, isn't it? But basically what it shows you is that there's also, in every sector, there's lots of things that people are thinking about in terms of adaptation. So, typically, because I work in Africa, we focus a lot on things like water storage systems and better irrigation efficiency. We look at adjusting the timing of planting and adjusting the mix of crops. We look at where can you relocate people who are chronically vulnerable to things like flooding. And it's not always easy. I think you remember the slides from 2 weeks ago. Flood camps are increasingly, in some parts of the world, becoming permanent fixtures, because once people have been moved, they've been flooded off their, especially if they're hillside farmers, they've been flooded into a camp on the side of the road somewhere. Then a country like Rwanda looks around and says, and that's sometimes people say that one of the motivations for a country like Rwanda to put pressure on Congo was because if they can add a little bit more territory to themselves, even for brief periods of time, then their herders can move in and benefit from those resources during times of say, drought and hardship. So there may be, underlying these things, much of it is to try and get the people who caused the genocide, but there may also be some ecological drivers that under scarcity, one outlet is to move across the border, Congo having enormous resources compared to Rwanda. And also, for many, many decades, herders did move across the border when there was droughts. But we know that in a place like Sudan, where you have these cycles of herders moving along with water availability and developing a symbiotic relationship with farmers, so that they would leave manure behind, they would use that water, and they would move. Climate change, in the case of Sudan, many people would argue, has upset that balance. So in a sense, Jeffrey Sachs argues, the herders come too early now. And it's now, the benefits to the farmers are much less. This is not to say that there weren't all sorts of other things driving the conflict, but it's a complicating factor, that the timing of things upsets these symbiotic relationships. But in all of these areas, there's lots and lots of different things we can do. I don't want to go on much longer. Get to this other response. Geoengineering is slowly emerging among elements of the scientific community as an area worth research, in which there's a number of things that we might be able to do if adaptation and mitigation prove inadequate. This is a nice diagram which shows you some of the ideas that are being floated out there, and I've just organized them in this pretty typical way of organizing them into sort of solar radiation management. So you reduce the amount of sunlight, big umbrellas in the sky and mirrors and things like that. There's some good images. Greenhouse gas remediation, artificial trees and iron fertilization of the oceans so that they can absorb more carbon and so on. There's a good example of a big air filtering artist's conception. Arctic geoengineering, where people have come up with crazy ideas like covering the Arctic with more water so that the ice will thicken during the cold season, so that it will then not melt as quickly as it warms up. So if you could get big sprayers covering massive amounts of the Arctic with water during the cold season, then you'd have thicker ice, and it wouldn't, as we all know, wouldn't melt as quickly. Things like that, and heat transport. Putting these massive ocean pipes into the water to mix cold water with the warmer water on the top. So the responses, so we've gone through all these things. The notion of sustainability, the pros and cons of mitigation, the trouble with developing a cost-benefit analysis. Adaptation is something that we have to do, but lots of disagreements over there's a big difference between adaptation in the Netherlands and adaptation in Bangladesh, and what should we invest in and how do we use scarce resources. What we have to our advantage is we have good science. So we have lots and lots of compelling scientific information about climate change. It's not perfect. There's things scientists still don't fully understand about carbon releases and cloud formation and things like that. It's not perfect, but it's very compelling. We have powerful networks that are committed to taking the science and turning it into new institutions, new regulations, new patterns of behavior. We have some large-scale laws like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in place to try and create a space where people can meet and discuss, talk about adaptation and who's going to fund it, and what will we fund, and mitigation, and what should our targets be, and who's going to be responsible, and so on. Now, we know that system has not generated hard targets as quickly as many people would like to see. We have a strong business case that has emerged over the years in which scientific knowledge has been incorporated into compelling reason for why businesses ought to be involved in it. So we have lots in our favor. And people think, well, given that, shouldn't we be able to move more aggressively along this trajectory? We've been building awareness, can we deepen that, and then get people information that really makes it clear what the problem is here in California. And on that basis start to experiment in San Diego and in the Central Valley and in Los Angeles with other things so that in the next decade we start to really move towards some more fundamental changes. And wouldn't it be nice if we've got good science and we've got lots of people committed to this and we've got some regulations in place to start us moving in the right direction, we've got lots of good ideas, but we face lots of obstacles. One is uncertainty. We know that typically, and it seems that people do this at all levels, everybody has some area, every household, every individual, every business has some area where they make long-term investments. We save for retirement, we pay off our house, whatever it is, we save for our kids' education. We all make these long-term investments. But we also make a lot of short-term investments. In fact, we live in that. And in government and in business and in our daily lives, a lot of things are what's going to happen today or this week or this year. So we're not always thinking about 20 years from now. We have an area where we think about that, but we're not always thinking about it. And economists have pointed out that, on issues like this, it's very hard to persuade people that now, today is the time to act. When you look at when you say to them, we're not sure, but we do think an investment today, 20 or 30 years from now, you'll be glad you made it. Your businesses will be stronger, your economy will be stronger, your household will be safer, your children and grandchildren will have improved prospects. And the typical response is, well, what if we wait another year? How much is that all going to change if we wait another year? Is it really going to be radically different if we wait another year? Now, we know people do that when it comes to things like retirement saving too. Then everybody says, start putting your money away when you're 21, and by the time you're 65, you'll be rich. And yet we know that many Americans at the age of 50 have still not started saving for retirement. And we know that although it might be on paper easy to accumulate funds for retirement, the average American has a remarkably small amount of retirement funds saved, even though we're on the threshold of the biggest retirement in human history as the baby boomers, but they just don't have enough money saved. Or some of them are fabulously wealthy and have trillions of dollars of assets, but many of them just don't have enough money saved. They've been putting it off. They didn't do it at 20, they didn't do it at 30, started to do a little bit at 40, 50, they're starting to get scared. But it's hard to know how we get people to decide that now is right. And economists don't have a good argument, and science is not. People are skeptical. There's about a quarter of the population in this country and elsewhere in the world that simply don't believe it. They simply think there's another option. And then there's all these other priorities. That's one of the problems with pluralism. If you've got to decide, do you invest in education? My kids are in school today. They're in the school system right now. And part of me would say, our school system in California ranks third from the lowest in the country. So it's at the very bottom of the country. And our country ranks at the very bottom of the OECD. So my kids are getting just about the worst possible education. I could put them in Canada or the UK or Germany or anywhere else and they'd be better off. So part of me says, I want my money to go into education. And part of me says it's not really fair that 35% of Americans or whatever the numbers don't have health care. So I want money to go. So there's all these other, that's the problem with pluralism, is that it leads to suboptimal policy outcomes. Because there tends to be, unless we're in some like a state of pitched war with an invader, it's almost impossible to build a full coalition around an aggressive policy. So you can move things forward a little bit on education, a little bit on healthcare, a little bit on climate change, a little bit. But it's hard to say, look, this is dire. I suppose that if 1/5 of America was flooded, like Pakistan was, in the summer, that might change our thinking. If all of California was underwater for 6 weeks, and 35 million people were forced to relocate overnight into Arizona, and then we might feel more of the urgency. So pluralism mitigates against it, skepticism, and of course, spoilers. There are companies that benefit from the status quo, who look and they say, a change is going to put the most penalties on us. Whether us is oil and gas, or us is cars, or us is whatever. It's going to put the most cost on us in the long run. Ultimately, we're the losers here. If you find that tobacco has massively negative health incomes, the obvious losers are going to be people who are producing tobacco. So they let there and first they fight it, they challenge it, then they look for new markets for it, so that in the end the world's probably smoking in fact, if you look at smoking, some countries are seeing a steady increase in the number of smokers. Even as other countries are seeing a slight decrease, other countries are taking off in smoking. So in a sense, we've just reallocated the problem. We haven't really made global health better. And then there's the issue of what sometimes called global anarchy. That is, there's nobody in charge of the US. We've got a White House, and we've got Congress, and we've got the judiciary, and we've got 50 states, and we've got, I don't know how many counties and cities. And it's very hard to coordinate all this. And that problem is magnified if you put it alongside, we've also got China, we've got India, and we've got Pakistan. So we're in a situation which is not easy to govern. And even if it was, even if the UN had so much authority and so much credibility that everybody just sort of said, we totally trust your statements and so on, we've still got all these other problems of spoilers and skepticism and pluralism. So on the one hand, in the end, we have a pretty clear sense of the problem, pretty clear sense of the things that we ought to be doing, a lot of interesting ideas out there, the logic for acting mounting in government and business at the household level, more and more countries recognizing and feeling the impacts and wanting to do something, but we're still not over that major hurdle of overcoming the tendency to make small, very small, incremental steps in this direction. And that's why the Homer Dixons of the world say, problems this big, the incremental steps are not going to get us up to where they need to be before the problem overwhelms us. And other people saying, problems this big, but we're going to see some acceleration as we get more and more signals of it. And so, we've got some real opportunities. As people get more and more comfortable with this, and then we're going to see some real acceleration in terms of our response. It's true, I don't know. But I do know that right now, from the perspective of many scientists and economists, we are at this sort of critical decade or two period in which if we make one set of decisions, we may well be able to work our way out of here in a way that is fair and economically sound and environmentally sensitive. And if we make the wrong decisions, we may find that in 50 or 60 years, we're looking at this and we're saying, who would have ever thought that we could turn America into a despot or whatever? So thanks very much, and I think we can have a few minutes for questions and so on, but I see that Michael's here, so he may want to take over at this point.
Oh, no, you're in charge. I just want to catch the last bit. Thank you, Richard.
So, my pleasure.